Okay, we have a great multimedia presentation here for you this afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine, and we're very delighted to be hosting retired Admiral James Stavridis, who's here, of course, to talk about his engaging new novel, The Restless Wave, a novel of the United States Navy. And if there's anybody who knows the Navy, it's Jim Stavridis. He spent more than 30 years in uniform in the Navy, rising to the rank of 4-star admiral and serving as the top military officer of NATO. He also headed U.S. Southern Command, overseeing military operations through Latin America. And at sea, he commanded a Navy destroyer, a destroyer squadron, and an aircraft carrier battle group. He's known, though, not only as an accomplished sailor, but also as a strategist and a scholar. He has a PhD in international relations and did a stint as dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts. He's currently a partner and the vice chair of global affairs of the Carlyle Group. He's also chair of the board of the Rockefeller Foundation. And in his spare time, he's the chief international analyst for NBC News and a Bloomberg Opinion Weekly columnist. Plus, he has an impressive track record as an author. He's written or co-written 10 nonfiction books, drawing heavily on his experience in the military. And 3 years ago, he came out with his first novel, 2034, which was followed by a second work of fiction earlier this year, 2054. And there's another one coming, I just learned, with called 2084. And anyway, those were co-written with a great novelist, Elliot Ackerman. Now, Jim's new novel, which he did on his own, is about a young man who, guess what, joins the Navy on the eve of the Second World War, and he is then tested under pressure in the war years at sea in the Pacific. While both that young sailor and another principal character in the book are completely invented, many of the others are based on real naval officers. So you have Jim's fictional imaginary characters interacting with these actual real officers and engaging in a number of events in the book that are drawn from actual incidents, like the attack on Pearl Harbor and the battles of Midway and Guadalcanal. I mean, much of the military action is fact-based. As one reviewer noted, Jim's love of the Navy shows well in these pages, and he intends this book to be the start of a series centered around his main character, Scott Bradley James. In fact, Jim's already at work on the next novel in the series, continuing to explore his fictional sailor's career and personal voyage. I think Jim is going to go through some slides here and talk, and then we'll take some questions. So please join me in welcoming Admiral Jim Stavridis.
Well, what an honor to be in one of the iconic independent bookstores of the United States of America. I've been coming here as a consumer of literature for throughout the life of the store. And when Brad and Lisa took it over 15 years ago now, it only continued to move up. And thank you so much. As you just heard, the novel is set in the beginning days of the Second World War, and it has, like all great literature, some themes. And I want to just kind of touch on these themes. And the first one may not be obvious. The first one is Dante's Inferno. The book is very loosely based on Dante's Inferno. Why? Because the Second World War, for that greatest generation, was an inferno. They went through almost circles of hell, beginning with Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway, Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa, Iwo Jima. Each of these major epic battles were deep, deep challenges. Number two, it's a book about that greatest generation. And by the way, here we think about the greatest generation, and everybody can tell you they were brave. They were courageous. They stood for the country. They went fearlessly into battle. I think all those things were true. But remember, they were young. They were unformed. They were untested. President Bush, Sr., an epic naval aviator, one of the youngest people ever to wear the wings of gold of the Navy, shot down in combat, rescued by a submarine. It's an amazing story. Decades later, George Bush looked back on his time in World War II, and he said, I was scared, but I was willing. I was young, but I was ready. I had barely begun to live when I started to see sailors die. That's an unformed, untested generation. And they stood and delivered, but not without mistakes, not without misturns. And I'd invite everybody here to think back to your 20s. You're 23 years old, 24 years old. Did you make mistakes? Did you turn the wrong way? Did you rock some relationship in a bad way? I bet you did. And a second great theme of this novel is that series of flaws in young people, how they overcome them, how they move through the inferno and eventually find their way out. And then third and finally, to bring it to the present day, I wanted to write the novel in order to look at the past and think about what can we learn about today's world from what happened 80 years ago. How about this? I am constantly asked, and I should be, hey, Admiral, are we going to end up in a war with China? What would that be like? Well, we don't have to imagine what that would be like. We did it. We fought a great power war with Japan, the empire of Japan. We can learn from that and hopefully avoid a war with China. We can also look at Ukraine today, where massive technologies are sweeping across the battlefield. Hey, that happened in early World War II. Sonar, radar, cryptography, the cybersecurity of the day, code breaking, new ways to employ aircraft carriers. We can learn from the experiences of World War II and apply them to the present day. And then finally, and Brad alluded to it, it's a novel about the sea. It's about being at sea, about leaving your lover behind and going to sea. And by the way, while your lover is back at Pearl Harbor, maybe she meets somebody new. That's a reality. It's part of love and war in the sea. So let me unpackage each of those very briefly, then we'll open it up for some comments and questions. First is the Dante's Inferno theme in this. It's not a heavy hand. This isn't, retelling the legend of Achilles, but there are little Easter eggs and clues through the book. And I'd invite any reader to kind of consider and think about how profound and powerful that life experience is of overcoming challenge and then seeing another one in front of you, and another one in front of you, and another one in front of you. And yes, there's a Virgil in this book, the Roman poet who helps guide Dante through the Inferno. And by the way, his girlfriend in Pearl Harbor, her real name is Beatrice, like the Beatrice, the lover of Dante in the Inferno. And by the way, if you're really deep into Dante, you would know that Beatrice loved pomegranates. And thus, the character in the novel drinks pomegranate martinis. Brad mentioned some of the admirals you'll meet along the way. You'll meet some admirals, you'll meet some sailors, but you'll also meet people like this. Who is this? Ernest Hemingway. The novel actually opens in 1937 in Key West, where Scott Bradley James is a very young, very unformed individual. He's got a lot going for him. He's like 6 feet tall. He's got beautiful sandy hair. He's a real Florida saltwater cowboy. He's an expert sailor and boater. He's also a pretty intense gambler. He is known to get into fights. He can drink pretty hard. He's kind of a mixed bag. He falls into the orbit of Ernest Hemingway, who at that moment in Hemingway's life, I have to pause and remember, he was in the process of divorcing his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer, in order to run off and marry this woman, Martha Gellhorn, who, by the way, herself, a war correspondent, logged more time in combat than Ernest Hemingway did. A fascinating duo. Scott Bradley James falls into that world. There's also a segment here at the Naval Academy. Now, I'm a graduate of the Naval Academy, and I'll be the first to tell you, when you walk into the gates of the Naval Academy as a 17-year-old, and those gates close behind you, all you can think is, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. It really is a Dante-esque moment. And at the Academy, like all midshipmen, any Naval Academy grads here, by the way? I see, yeah, quite a few fans, actually, I guess. At the Academy, Scott Bradley James makes some additional mistakes, some pretty profound ones, and yet he manages to overcome. He graduates, and this is the storied class of 1941, well known at the Academy because they don't graduate in June of 41. They graduate early in February of 41 because the Navy knows war is coming. And that class disperses, and we follow our protagonist to Hawaii, where he spends a few months before the war begins. And by the way, if you haven't seen this movie or haven't seen it in a while, this is the Ben Affleck Pearl Harbor. It's pretty good. And a couple of scenes in it will capture you and were part of my own thinking as I crafted this novel. You'll follow along back and forth. Character goes ashore, goes back to sea. He's in the Battle of Midway. He's in the Battle of Guadalcanal. And so you're seeing the beginning of this war and some of those big themes play out on a very human scale. And I think what makes great historical fiction, and I don't know if this is great historical fiction or not, but I'll tell you historical fiction that is, Hilary Mantel's trilogy about Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell, two-time Booker Award winner. What made those books great is that she pulled the scale of the big story down and made individual stories and characters. That's what I've tried to do in this novel. And then finally, yeah, it's about great power conflict, and it's about technology changing, and it's about leadership and learning from other leaders. And then finally, and this is my last slide, this is a remarkable figure in World War II history, a real person, but someone who plays an interesting role in the novel. This is Dory Miller. Dory Miller was a big guy, 6'3", 240, comes out of Texas in the 1930s. No real opportunity there. Dory Miller joins the United States Navy. It's a segregated Navy. The only job he can get in the Navy is as a mess cook. So he takes it. He's on a battleship at Pearl Harbor, and on that day, December 7th, 1941, the battle starts, and his battle station is the officer's wardroom, the mess. His job, to make donuts, so they're available. Dory Miller decides, I can do more than make donuts right now. He charges up to the bridge of the ship. He helps rescue the commanding officer of the battleship who is grievously wounded. And then Dory Miller goes down on the right there. You can see the photograph. Goes down and mans an anti-aircraft gun and shoots down at least one, possibly two Japanese Zeros. He's never fired this kind of gun before. It's a remarkable story of initiative and courage and grace under pressure, as Hemingway would say, in combat. Here's the bad news and the good news. After this engagement, after Pearl Harbor, he receives the Navy Cross from the Fleet Commander Chester Nimitz, but is then reassigned to another carrier and dies at sea 2 years later, USS Gambier Bay. So he does not survive the war. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. 2 years ago, the U.S. Navy decided the name of the next nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. You know, like the USS Roosevelt, the USS Bush, the USS Reagan, named for presidents. The next one is USS Dory Miller. You'll meet Dory Miller. He's one of many, many stories along the way. So with that, I'll simply say, in the end, this is a book about sailing turbulent seas, about restless waves, which comes from the Navy hymn. But the idea of the book, ultimately, is one of persevering, overcoming, facing challenges, stepping, standing, and delivering, recognizing your flaws and your mistakes, and working hard to try and overcome them. That's the story of the Restless Wave. Thank you very much. Pleasure being with you all. Thank you. I'd love to take some questions and comments. I see a lot of friends and fellow Naval Academy officers and others in the crowd. Sir.
Thank you for writing this fantastic book.
Could you speak right into the mic?
Can you hear me now? So my father was a young Marine in World War II and fought in several island campaigns, including Saipan, where apparently, unbeknownst to me, he received a medal for saving the life of an officer.
Nice.
Never told us about that.
Yeah.
And I stumbled upon it from some old newspaper clippings, so it was never discussed. Could you talk a little bit about that ethos?
I really can. And the conventional view of this is, as you indicate with your father, many of these young men, they were mostly, overwhelmingly young men, some young women, came home from combat and just didn't want to talk about it. They just wanted to build the country, go to college, get married, have kids. Admirable. There is, however, a pretty rich strain of, I'd say, 20 to 30% of these young men and some women who did tell their stories. And I have lived in the last 2 years reading their memoirs and reading their stories. I wish there were more. And what I am discovering, and I'd invite anybody listening, if you have a relative who served in the Second World War, maybe a grandfather or a great uncle, and you have access to either a story you know or something written down, feel free to send it to me. I will get it to the Naval Historical Center in Washington, D.C., where it will repose with other memoirs. And B, I'll read it, I'll learn from it, and I'll try to weave it into the next volume of this book. Thank you. Others? Yes, sir, a young man here. Go ahead.
How hard is it to get into the Naval Academy?
How hard is it? Well, it's obviously really easy because I got into it. And number two, you don't have to be very tall to get into the Naval Academy. It's challenging, but here's what you got to do. And if you can't see him, how old are you? This 10-year-old is already thinking 7 years ahead, and I admire that. Here's the key to getting into the Naval Academy. It's not about being brilliant and getting straight A's. It's not about being the very best athlete. It's not about having the very best character of everybody. The trick is be good at each of those. It's the whole person concept. The motto of the Naval Academy is to prepare midshipmen mentally, morally, and physically. So you got to be pretty athletic, but not perfect. You got to be pretty smart. Math is important. And you got to have a good heart and good character. And if you catch me on the way out, I'll give you a card, and you send me a letter in 6 years, and I'll get you into the Naval Academy. Any 10-year-old asking that question needs to go to the Naval Academy. Others, yes, sir. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yep. I'm going to repeat the question. It is a great one. The gentleman was just pointing out his relatives did not get into the Naval Academy, but instead they went to a place called Kings Point. We have a Kings Point graduate right here, by the way, Kevin Billings, a good friend of mine. And Kings Point, as you may or may not know, is a service academy of the United States of America, and it prepares merchant mariners, a very distinguished part of sea service. We lost hundreds, thousands of U.S. mariners in the Second World War, for example. And I was privileged to give the graduation speech at Kings Point a few years ago. I don't often share this, but I will. It's an intimate crowd here. I got up, and it hurt me to do it, but I got up and I said, I got to tell the truth. The ship handlers from Kings Point are better than the ones from Annapolis. So Kevin Billings, you do have a real skill handling a ship. I think we shoot our guns better, but you guys drive the ships pretty well. But thank you, sir. Yes, Kings Point is a fundamental part of our sea services. Let me add to that, by the way. You know, we've talked a lot about Navy and destroyers and guns and merchant marine. A big part of this book is the Marine Corps, the U.S. Marine Corps. I grew up in the Marine Corps. My father was a career officer. He was a combat Marine in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He retired as a colonel of Marines. Last command was a big reinforced battalion, essentially a regiment in Vietnam. And I, in fact, went to Quantico High School, just down the road. So I went off to the Naval Academy, and I thought, okay, I'm going to be a Marine infantry officer, just like my dad. And I thought that, and then after my first year, the academy sends you out to sea. So for the very first time, I mean, we were like a camping family, not a seagoing family, Marines. So for the first time, I'm on a ship. I'm on a cruiser. It's San Diego. We get underway at 5 o'clock. Sun starts setting. We're driving into the setting sun. Man, I was like St. Paul on the road to Damascus. The scales dropped from before my eyes, and I knew I wanted to be a sailor. And my point is that Navy and Marine Corps are just so fundamentally intertwined, and we have our differences, and the two principal male characters in this novel are in a love triangle with a beautiful Hawaiian graduate student at the University of Hawaii. But that Navy-Marine Corps partnership and rivalry is very much part of this book, and the sea services are Navy, Merchant Marine, Coast Guard, and Marines. Never forget that. Others? Yes, sir. Oh, thanks.
It's good to see you, Admiral.
Yes.
It's been a while.
Yeah, great to see you.
I want to just follow up on something that the original gentleman said when he was talking about his father as a veteran. I was the a medical historian of the Navy for many years, and I interviewed many, many World War II veterans.
Yeah.
And one thing I learned from most of them was the fact that they never talked about their experiences. And there were reasons. I would ask them, why have you ever told your family what you witnessed in the Pacific? And they would usually say, no, I wouldn't want to burden my children and my wife with the horrors that I saw.
Sure.
So they would carry this thing through their lives. They may have had PTSD. It wasn't called that then.
Yeah.
But then I would ask them, why do you feel comfortable telling me these stories? Well, you're a historian, you're dispassionate, you understand the context, but you're not a member of my family, and you're not going to show any value judgments on any of this stuff. But it turned out, for many of these, I felt like I was a psychologist. I was giving them an opportunity to tell their stories, but many of them never told the stories, and they took their stories to the grave. Fortunately, I got many of those stories, and I'll see that you get some of them, Matt.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Well said, and thanks for sharing that. I think we got time for one more question, and then I'm going to sign some books. Sure.
My grandfather was in the Navy. He left home. His mother was a widow with 5 children. He left home, and he lied about his age. He enlisted in the Spanish-American War.
Yeah.
Then he served in World War I and served after that. He eventually retired, but at retirement he could take an exam and couldn't finally become an officer. He did pass the exam. He retired, but when World War II occurred, he was recalled and he served through Second World War at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I never heard very many stories.
Yeah.
My mother and my grandmother did. They would say, "Oh, you told that before it played."
Yeah. Yeah.
There aren't really know very much.
Yeah.
Except that he served in three.
Yeah, and I am very thankful of I'd say again, about 20% of veterans who have in fact told their stories, recorded them for posterity. It's critically important that they do that. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I taught innovation at the Naval Postgraduate School for 20 years
Oh, nice.
after a 20-year career doing IT and space systems in the 80s and 90s. So I'm really attuned to the parts of your book that are especially about technological innovation and most importantly for me, the resistance to what was changing at that time. So I really appreciated your account of the development of CIC
Yeah, thank
and
you.
also the story about the seniors who just couldn't go there.
Yeah.
So can you speak a little bit
can.
about that, but also about where do you see what we're facing now?
Sure.
Because there's a lot of change right now. of
Yeah, I
course.
want to highlight somebody who will appear in the next book, and that is a woman admiral named Grace Hopper. So Grace Hopper comes along in the 1920s and 30s, gets a PhD in math from Yale in the 1930s. Woman, remarkable. And then ends up inventing what we think of as machine learning today. She invented the language of COBOL. She's the mother of COBOL, the very earliest programming language. She taught me programming at the Naval Academy in the 1970s. So I know her quite well. And she talked constantly about the need to push, the need to innovate, the need to shake the system, the need to challenge it. And she was very inspirational in my life. And again, she will appear in the next volume. In this volume, she is building the very first, what we would think of as a mainframe computer. So it's an example of innovation turns not just on big events, but on individual people. Big doors swing on small hinges. Grace Hopper might have looked small. She was, in that sense, swung a pretty big door. Brad Graham.
Yeah, so let me ask you a little bit, Jim, to talk about your evolution as a writer,
Sure.
because not everybody can go from writing nonfiction, as you've done, to these novels. I mean, and of course, writing a novel takes more than knowing the subject inside and out. I mean, you have to figure out how to develop character and set scenes and shape a plot. Where have you learned to do all that?
On the job training. I have always loved writing and literature. I was the kid in high school who was the editor of my high school newspaper. At the Naval Academy, I was the editor-in-chief of Log Magazine, the only publication of the Academy. I've published 2,000 articles in newspapers, journals, magazines. I write a weekly column for Bloomberg. So step one is you build and you learn and you grow. Step two, you read. You read incessantly. Good writers are deep readers, in my view. And when I get locked up writing something, I'll pull down a book that I really admire and just read a few pages. I'll pull down Margaret Atwood. I'll read a few pages of The Handmaid's Tale, for example, because her prose is so crystalline. I'll pull down Winston Churchill, the Second World War. I'll pull down the King James Bible and get those rhythms banging around. So number two is reading. And number three, the evolution from nonfiction, which is challenging and hard, and all writing is hard, but it's not as hard as fiction. And fiction, I've learned writing with a co-author, Elliot Ackerman, who's a very accomplished writer. And I've developed, and as you pointed out, this is my first solo novel. And I feel it's like in Pinocchio. I'm a real boy now. All right, I'm going to sign some books. Thank you very much. It's great being with all of you.
So copies of Jim's book